If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining. Today, our guest is Natalie Smith. Natalie is a best-selling author and human resources expert with over 20 years of experience. She is the president and founder of PeopleWiseHR, where they bring solutions for people, practices, and performance to develop winning workforce strategies. Natalie, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm looking forward to our conversation on how business can best meet the expectation of employees. But first, would you mind sharing a little bit more about your career and what led you to the creation of PeopleWiseHR?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much, Arnette, for inviting me to your platform. I'm happy to be here today. I will try to make this a fairly brief story, but let's just say that, I was a college major in marketing back in the years where they told you, if you go to school for this, this is where you get the job. And it didn't quite work out. So I evolved into human resources by starting off and working at a temporary agency. And so I got into recruiting. And in the course of my career, started at a temp agency, then got a corporate job in financial services and banking, and kind of stayed there for a number of years. Luckily for me, I had roles, especially in recruiting. It gave me exposure to all different aspects of HR. As the recruiter, you have to talk to folks about a lot of different things at a company. And I learned a lot about, businesses and how organizations run. And after working in a corporate environment, a large corporate environment, I had a stint with the Federal Reserve Board in DC. I had a stint with Freddie Mac. Started getting into more of a traditional banking environment and ended my career in terms of working for someone at a community bank in DC. And I spent 10 years there building infrastructure. And really, when I got there, they did not have an HR department. So I got to touch or feel and do a lot of things, but it was a smaller, intimate environment, a very mission-focused organization. And over time, after I built sort of the infrastructure from an HR perspective, what else was there for me to do? I loved working at the organization. I loved the mission. I loved the work that they did for, nonprofits and for, underserved communities. But I, sort of had, an emptiness inside me. I had hit the ceiling there and I didn't necessarily want to go anywhere else. I just wanted to do something different. And so after many conversations with my boss at the time, who was the CEO of the organization, although he tried to give me different opportunities, I just realized there was more for me to do. And the only way for me to do that was to take a leap of faith. And so, in 2016, I turned 50. My son graduated high school, and I had this epiphany or actually it wasn't an epiphany, it was more so this kind of release of, now I have this window to maybe focus on myself more. And I decided to take a leap of faith and step out and do my own business. I had started the consulting practice a few years before, but guess what? Life got in the way, right? We get up and we think, oh, I have to commute to work or I have to get this project done. And I didn't put myself first. And in 2016, I made a commitment to myself to take an hour every day and focus on me. No TV, no internet, no phone. And it really propelled me to get to a place where I could kind of put this business together and run it and do it. So since 2016, I have been running my business on a full-time basis. And here I am today with you.
Well, congratulations. And it's kind of interesting to hear that when you turned 50, that's what you kind of got inspired and you were ready to start that entrepreneurial journey, because that's exactly the time it hit me as well. And so my first business I started, right as I turned 50, and It's been a wonderful journey ever since. But let's dive into the job market, and I'd like to get your thoughts on what you think the job market is today. And are employers gaining back any of the leverages they had a couple of years ago? And how do things sit?
Well, I would say I work with businesses now in my company. I work with a few international firms, a few that are sort of in different areas of the United States, and then lots of them in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And I would say that in some instances, I would say employers are gaining a little bit more of a foothold in terms of, I'll position it this way, in terms of getting back to where things used to be per se.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I would say that employers are learning to be more flexible and sort of try as best they can to meet in the middle. And I actually think that is going to be what propels companies to continue to excel. I think the workforce, obviously from when I started working and maybe you started working, is very different in terms of generational perspectives, as well as cultural perspectives. The different age groups just see life very differently from the way, I saw life, and when I started my business, it was called NAS Consulting. I just took my initials and said, hey, this is the name. And then after getting out there, people kept saying, well, what is this NAS Consulting? And it led me, I was a marketing major. It led me to change my company name. So I rebranded and I named it PeopleWise. And I got to the name PeopleWise because, I have become known for, and I think it's my strength, being mindful of people and human beings, and, folks appreciated my perspective on things. And so I think, when we talk about the workforce and where they are, I think those companies that try to be wise about people and the people they employ are the ones that are learning to navigate this new world we find ourselves in. But I won't say that employers are quite winning. I think they're learning that they have to sort of meet in the middle or give a little bit more than they may be willing, to give. In this particular geographic area, I know, especially in particular in DC, there's a push for folks to come back to work, especially from a government perspective. And a lot of that is really not necessarily driven by the plight of those individuals. It's driven by the fact that that city needs that, that hub needs folks around to help businesses stay, in place, and, to help their travel system. Because really with folks not being at work, it does affect the other parts of the economy. So it's a much larger thing. But I think that employees themselves are going to be steadfast and hold to what's important to them. And I think being that it's going to be driven by sort of a different generation of folks, I do think our workforces will look very different as we continue to move forward.
Yeah. We had a podcast just a few back that we actually talked about the generations.
Okay.
And it's really interesting to dive into the nuances that each generation brings to the workforce. And frankly, that's probably what helps us all keeps going. So
I agree. I definitely agree. It makes us all think about things differently and look at things differently. And as we all know, COVID had a huge impact on life itself for many of us. And so we walked away with a whole different lens on how we view the world and how we view life. And I think, we may get to this conversation a little later in our discussion, but it also has a lot to do with what folks feel they value in life. And it used to be that, our goal was to get up in the morning and get to work and work as hard as you can and work all day. And not to say that folks aren't putting in the same effort. It just looks very different than, what we may have been accustomed to.
Yep. So, I know at the end of the day, we're all in business to be profitable.
Yes.
But, from my perspective, in order to be profitable, we have to put employees first. So I've always believed that. And what can you provide as advice on how employers can balance, the needs of their team while at the same time meeting the goals and needs of the company?
Well, this is one of the approaches that I take with my clients. And that is to say, we often say that we value employees, but we have to kind of, peel back the layers and say, what does that really mean? And I think it means part of it is having an honest conversation with your employees and with your staff as much as you can, or, about what's important to you. I think the tables are turned in the sense that, the workplaces drove what happens at work. Now it's sort of the tables are turned in that the employees in the workplace really are driving a lot of what happens at work. So you have to ask the question. We no longer know. I could say, hey, you should have this benefit and you should do these things and you should have this happy hour session, but that might not be what a particular company's employees want. It may look very different. So I think, we have to start with asking that question. And then from there, you build the plan. And I think the organization, has the ability to say yes and no. And oftentimes you have to say yes and no. But the things that you say yes to are going to be the things that really tie to what's important to those employees in that particular environment. And I think that in itself is what creates that engagement. We use that word very loosely. That connection is what creates that engagement, because I think there's a sense of genuineness about how that organization is approaching working with its employees and finding that balance. And when people are generally happy and comfortable, generally they're going to be more present. They're going to be more focused. They're going to perform better, hopefully, less issues, and more about how do we work together to move this organization forward. So I think that's sort of definitely one of the approaches, I encourage companies to take, which is to really, truly get to know the folks that you're working with every day.
That was great. And you just mentioned the word benefits. And I'd like to ask you about that, which is, for businesses and leaders that realize, okay, maybe I need to offer enhanced benefits and perks for employees. How can they best measure the return on that investment that they're making?
Well, you can measure it a couple ways. What's interesting is, I've had this conversation with many of my clients, and I see this discussion quite often in workplaces, around benefits. And right now, from what I've seen, probably in the last year or so, the number one trending benefit is flexibility. Right?
Yep.
And so I think that, there's a subjective measure, and then there's obviously a qualitative measure, right? I think you have to look at kind of, within an organization, what you want to accomplish and what you want employees to accomplish. Sometimes that's very framed out in goals and things of that nature. And sometimes it's not, but I think there's a value that comes with folks being comfortable. And so I think you look at your qualitative measures that you may have in place and say, hey, I'm going to, for example, I'm working with companies now who say, we've been at home, but now I want staff to come into the office 2 or 3 days a week, as a general rule. And I think they have to measure, how are things going in terms of any performance metrics prior to that, and how are things going after, those folks start coming back into the office, or even if a company starts looking at having folks come back 5 days a week, what impact does that have? And you're going to be able to tell that, I think, in some ways through engagement. If you're doing engagement surveys, you're asking your employees about how they're doing. And then you're also going to engage it in performance metrics that you may already have in place. At the end of the day, I think, what you see is, what you have to ask yourself, and this is what I tell clients, is where do you want people to spend their time? I think we were so robotic in the past. Now we can see that, hey, if I have an employee who's an A player, I have to do a little bit more around making sure they stay happy, because, they want to be comfortable and I want them to perform well. Well, what does that mean? So if you didn't tell that A player who's saying, hey, I enjoy working from home, I want you to come in 3 days a week, and they're spending an hour or two on the road each way. They're drained by the time they get to work. I would think that there was a measure, in terms of their work that you can see. So I think it's about finding a balance between, your qualitative measures and then making sure that you have folks engaged in terms of giving them some of the flexibility that they want.
Yeah. So as a company starts to examine the overall compensation structure and benefits of the organization, who do you think should be at the table?
Obviously, leadership, because there's a cost involved. But I also think it's important to have a sense from folks, in particular on the benefit side, what benefits are important outside of what we talked about, flexibility, obviously, maybe like your health benefits. But right now, what seems to be also trending are benefits that are more about lifestyle, benefits that are about mental health wellness. Those tend to be trending up quite highly in alignment with your regular medical, dental, vision, things of that nature. You're going to see, I think, benefit structures and even compensation to some degree structure around how do I make the life of this person better? What does it take on a daily basis to make this, person's life better? From a compensation perspective, it's a little different because one, companies want to stay competitive in a marketplace, but at the same time, companies, depending on their size and their profitability, obviously you have budgets to be mindful of. And while that can be limiting, and it often is limiting, I don't know that. I do think you have to have a sense of where you are in the marketplace. And I do think organizations have to have a strategy around how they approach compensation within their organizations, So, at that table, along with leadership, at times, I do think you want to involve, some piece of the employee population. But when those decisions have to be made, obviously that's a leadership decision. I think it's important for it to be transparent. And I think that's the connection with, some of the things that we're talking about is transparency. An organization might not be able to pay the most for its employees, for budget reasons, but they may have a great mission and they may have a great purpose. And I think one of the trends that you also see today with workforces is that they gravitate to something with purpose.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I love that concept. And I believe every business has to have a clearly stated purpose that the employees engage with.
Yep. And I think it's a valuable tool. I do think that many times, I worked in a community banking environment. So, I didn't necessarily work at a Bank of America, but we might compete on a real estate deal with the Bank of America, right? And what's the difference? What's the nuance? How do I get that salesperson or that business development person to come to this small community bank relative to this huge organization that can obviously pay more? It's the mission. What do you want? What's your purpose? Where do you go? Where making this impact that you can see, touch, and feel? And I think that has some value to it for an organization.
Oh, absolutely. And, at the beginning of our conversation today, I kind of started off with our purpose, which was, for S2 Verify, is to help clients hire with confidence and manage their insider risk. So that's one of the, that's our purpose. It's clearly stated, and we drive it with our team every day.
I believe that, yes.
So let's go to, you just mentioned another word that I'd like to follow up on, which is budget, and companies can find, budgets and for, different headcounts, they get tight from time to time. And what's your recommendation on how a company facing this can compete with other companies for talent?
Well, I think one of the ways we just talked a little bit about, which is leveraging sort of your mission and your purpose, branding your organization. Branding is a huge component of attracting talent. But then also from a budgetary perspective, I think organizations have to do more planning. Even in a limited space, you have the opportunity to plan, especially if you intend to grow. I think there needs to be more of a strategic approach, when it comes to compensation, as well as recruiting. I know, obviously, with most companies, the salary and the benefits are going to be your highest expenses. And how do you manage that over time? One way is, when you look forward, what does your growth pattern look like? And what capacity do you have to grow when it comes to your comp? Are you able to budget? Are you able to stay in alignment with whatever your local trend may be? And if you're not, then I think you need to think about, okay, how do I compensate for that? What else can I do? So part of it is going back to the things that we talked about as sort of those touchy-feely things that I think a lot of times companies dispel it, don't think they're as important, and they really are. Because I've seen people stay at a job, and I'm probably one, but I see it every time when a person is satisfied and happy, generally, it makes a big difference, and yes, they could go somewhere and get $10,000 or $20,000 more, but you know what? They feel connected to something at this organization. So I think, when a budget is limited, again, I think that has to be transparency. I encourage all companies, even, I work with some very small businesses who are just starting out, and I ask them to build that framework, start now explaining to employees, how you plan to grow, how you plan to increase their pay over time, and how you plan to stay competitive. You have to think about that. And during limiting times, it's kind of, I think, leveraging, the purpose, why we're here, and being a part of something bigger than just, the monetary aspect.
Yeah, so agree. Well, Natalie, our time is just about up. But before we sign off, I'd like to ask you a final question that I ask every guest. And that is, if S2 Verified were to conduct a background screening on you, would there be any surprises?
No, there'll be no surprises. One thing that I think folks miss about me is that I'm often in front of folks speaking, especially being in human resources, but I am actually an introvert.
Wow.
And I got into sort of human resources very, very long ago because I knew that for me, I looked at it as a deficiency then. I think there's definitely some value to being an introvert these days. But I thought, I'm going to do the opposite of what I'm comfortable with. And so for me, that's always been a takeaway in life. Sometimes we have to push ourselves to do what's uncomfortable to get to a different place and a higher level that we want to be at. So that's what I would leave you with today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining, and tell our audience where they can keep track of what's going on with you and PeopleWiseHR.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for having me today. I enjoyed our discussion. Folks can find me at www.peoplewisehr.net. You can also find me on LinkedIn under Natalie A. Smith, and you can find my book on Amazon. It's entitled The Power of Plan B, Leap into Your Greatness.
Wonderful, wonderful. So now I'd like to have a minute with my partners, Bill and Jim at S2 Verify. If we're helping our HR clients manage the biggest risk that they confront with pre-employment screening, is there one issue that stands out in your mind, Bill?
Yeah, the fact that they need to do it. At the end of the day, they need to know what kind of risk they're getting into with an individual, because nobody could do more harm to a company than, hiring somebody with the previous background. I mean, we've seen lawsuits that's got settled with millions and millions of dollars because they hired somebody and didn't do a background check on them. Or they did, a partial background check and they didn't do a thorough background check. And so we've seen individuals that actually went in and killed somebody at the plant. And so the company got sued. And at the end of the day, they're going to lose that lawsuit at, 10 times out of 10.
Yeah.
So, typically you got to do a background check so what you're getting into with these individuals that are going to work for your company and your brand.
Yeah. Jim, what about your thoughts on that topic?
It's a take off the same theme, Arnette. I see it every day. I call it, the trend to a low-cost, limited background. In other words, what's the least I can do for the least amount of money and hurry up, okay? When what we see time and time again are clients that come to us and go, you missed a record. Okay, let's talk about it. And the record we missed is out of the scope they set. And so the question becomes, well, how do I get that? Well, it's the age-old adage, it costs more or it takes more time. So from the framework of what we try to educate on is to do the most common and most common sense and practical approach to your background, but don't focus in on, can I get this done for $3 and I expect that much to be done. So we're making progress, but that is one of the biggest challenges we have.
For our audience, please tune in next week when we continue our conversation about the trends, challenges, and solutions in HR. We'll see you then. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do. Natalie, thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Right. Thank you.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.